I'm going to share some personal reflections on the work of Dag Hammarskjöld, in particular on international cooperation, on the role of the United Nations and the role of the Secretary Generals of the United Nations, and more in general on international civil service. And I think that the timing is quite ripe for this, not only because the United Nations has just appointed his new Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, to whom of course I wish my very best, but also because the SDGs were born in 25th of September 1961, and when the United Nations launched the first decade for sustainable development, which was very much one of the offspring also of Dag Hammarskjöld and other colleagues in the United States work. And also because the United Nations General Assembly is seriously discussing the opportunity to take forward the investigations on the death of Dag Hammarskjöld and colleagues. So I think it's quite timely, and is very important that we are here in this building today together to plant these very important seeds for the years to come. Now, as Mintze said, Dag Hammarskjöld, for those who may not necessarily be familiar with him, was elected Secretary General of the United Nations in 1953. He didn't know he was going to be elected, in fact, interestingly enough. And then he perished in a dubious plane crash that left open many question marks 8 years later when he was brokering a peace agreement on nowadays Congo and Zambia. And the General Assembly recently, in fact, pointed out that a further inquiry on investigation would be necessary to finally establish the facts of the matter. And I think that beyond justice that needs to be rendered to those servants who perished in the line of service, I think is also a question of justice and ethics for what the United Nations means and all the peoples that are serving with it, and I don't mean only the civil servants of the United Nations, but all the goodwill people that collaborate with the United Nations in one way and or the other. Now, Dag Hammarskjöld, during Dag Hammarskjöld's leadership between 1953 to 1961, the United Nations has gone through a fantastic change. And just to give you a number, the membership in itself almost doubled up. So you can imagine the complexity that brings to the decision making, and that was very much in the wake of the decolonization process. But also other important elements changed in its functioning. The member states established the permanent missions in Geneva and New York, which basically meant that they had permanent representatives here and in New York with whom urgent matters or more long-term matters could be discussed. The political functions of the Secretary General got gradually firmly established due to the practice of Dag Hammarskjöld and colleagues, the first peacekeeping operations, the systems of envoys, and so on and so forth, technical cooperation for countries. So you can imagine that in just a few years, in fact, that meant quite a dramatic change in a positive way in the functioning of not only the United Nations, but in international cooperation fundamentally. And certainly Dag Hammarskjöld was the inspirer of this change, but was not the only one. So definitely the work in those days was due to the strong command that he had, but also on the vision that he managed to inspire and to harness in other very close colleagues that worked within, not only within the United Nations, but also in the diplomatic community, in the science, in arts, and so on and so forth. So he literally reached out to all those who could actually help shape a vision for international cooperation and to bring into reality the vision that was embodied in the United Nations Charter. Now, during since Dag Hammarskjöld times, of course, there's been major changes in the world, from economic, social, political, etc. And Mintze again touched upon some of these. What I would like to recall here is that among these big changes, one in particular caught my attention is that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of organizations, of competent organizations that are willing, able, capable, and very active in collaborating in bringing forward the values of the United Nations and the programs that it represents. And they expect to play that role. And this basically has quite a major implication on the governance of the United Nations and how it works. Because member states are not necessarily any longer the owners of the United Nations, or rather they are the trustees on behalf of we, the people of the United Nations. So that is quite a major change if you pause for a second and we realize the power that it has behind it, what it means in terms of work and practice. Now, one immediate corollary of this is that the decisions that are taken by the United Nations they need to abide to certain standards. They need to reflect the best knowledge that is available not only within the delegates and the United Nations staff, but also in civil society, in business, and so on and so forth. They have to represent the shared interest, so a little bit beyond compromise. They need to embody a very powerful and pragmatic vision. They have to be in respect of the law. And fundamentally, they really need to harness the power, and they need to leverage the power of those who want to contribute and enable them to do so. So when you look behind the decision that the United Nations needs to take, it is expected to take, there's a lot that needs to be sort of thought through and see how to be taken forward. So this means quite important challenges in the way the United Nations decision-making in itself implies. And you touched upon, Mince, on a few points strongly related to this, including the use of will. Now, these processes are complex. We know that. And so it's kind of easy. I keep referring to you because also, again, you mentioned that that because of their complexity, sometimes people in these very rooms, feels that there is a bit of waste of time, loss of focus, and so on and so forth. But in fact, it's also here that quite strong vision can be forged when all those who are sitting in these rooms manage to go beyond the compromise and to shape a new and future vision for the future. So there's a bit of a fine line, but when that is possible to walk through that fine line, and that is again due to goodwill and strong intention, but also knowledge and determination and perseverance, this does open a new scenario, and the SDGs are definitely an important example of that. But also, 2015 has seen the reaching of 4 fundamental agreements, not only the SDGs, not only the Paris agreements, we also have the Addis Ababa action agenda on financing for development, and we have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. These 4 agreements together, they really charter a new paradigm for international cooperation, and I'll go back to it a little bit later. Now, the United Nations in this context was clearly conceived as an agent of change, like a tool, but it was not conceived as the cause of change. And I want to underline that point, because the cause of change resides in the consciousness of humanity. The cause of change resides in the consciousness of our own being, individually taken. And that, again, is a distinction that is always important to keep in mind. At the same time, because the United Nations was conceived as, is expected to be an agent of change, an instrument of change, it has to be also a model for change. So there is a constant expectations by we, the peoples of the United Nations, to constantly adjust. And if you want to be always on the cutting edge side, you really have to keep being there, and that implies that you change yourself. And Dag Hammarskjöld, during his leadership, really spent a lot of time in continuously articulating, explaining, putting forward the ideas and the precepts contained in the United Nations Charter. I mean, if you look at the reports of the United Nations in those years, in particular the annual report that the Secretary General puts forward every year, to which I understand that he personally contributed, there every single year he was articulating a future for the United Nations, a future for the role of the Secretary General, a future for international cooperation, and my country could work better together. So constantly explaining, articulating, engaging, so harnessing that thought that was behind the Charter of the United Nations, which was expecting, therefore, to be brought into reality. And I would say that the imaginative approach used by Dag Hammarskjöld and colleagues point us, is useful also for today's challenges. And in fact, if I used his approach, his work points us to a very interesting provision in the United Nations Charter, which is contained in Article 1 of the Charter. And now Article 1 is the heart, in a way, of the United Nations work. It's where the vision is articulated. And you will have the opportunity to read it through, but I would just want to recall here that the first Article 1, Paragraph 1 is about the maintenance of peace and security. Number 2 is about friendly relations among nations. Number 3 is achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of different nature. And number 4, which is really the one that I want to bring your attention here today, is, and I read it, I quoted, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. Now, this article seems to be very simple, and in fact it is. And what is interesting that through a study that I did of the San Francisco preparatory documents, you can see that this article was not that much debated, and it was adopted almost as it was proposed. And I myself have come through the negotiation of the Sendai framework, and I can tell you that each single word was carefully scrutinized. So this little attention given to Article 1.4 of the United Nations Charter for me was really amazing. I mean, it's something interesting there. And even in the subsequent commentaries that have been made of the United Nations Charter, very little attention has been paid to that specific article. So I was wondering why. I mean, why among all the articles and commas and paragraphs of the United Nations Charter, that one has received so little attention? And for me, in fact, this article is the most mysterious and fundamental of all, because it's the only article that speaks to the essence of the United Nations. It speaks to the being of the United Nations as opposed to the doing. So all these other articles is, about what the United Nations needs to do. This is about what the United Nations is. Now, to consider what something is not just an academic exercise. You can really focus on what is its main function. What is instrumental to, how it works. So the more you understand it, of course, the more you can have a sense on how to use it for the common purposes that are identified in the Charter. But let me tell you a little bit more on that, what I mean. What I mean is that the Article 1.4 of the United Nations Charter is telling us that until and unless we create this center for harmonizing the actions of nations, probably we are not going to achieve the first 3 points of Article 1. So Article 1.4 is clearly putting forward a necessary condition. Now, if that is true, now clearly nurturing such a center for harmonizing the actions of nations seems to be a fundamental priority to me. And is a priority for all those who wants to and foster and push for enhanced international cooperation and therefore serve humanity and the other kingdoms of nature, the planet, as clearly the Club of Rome and beyond pointed us to. Now, therefore, paragraph 4, for me, is a fundamental key to further imagine and then materialize the work and functioning of the United Nations. Now, its organs, the Secretariat, the function of the Secretary General, but also ultimately how to shape and imagine new forms of international cooperation. Now, because of this, I really believe that it is important then to focus on what harmonizing means, because that is a key word that this article contains. And fundamentally, this then would lead us to understand what is expected from the United Nations, what the United Nations is required to do. Now, I think that in this sort of inquiry, psychological studies can help us to see what that may mean. And I would like here to refer to important studies that a psychiatrist named Roberto Assagioli conducted in the past century from 1888, when he was born, until 1974. Now, through his work, through the work of psychiatrists and psychologists, we come to understand that harmonizing implies a sort of creating synthesis across different parts of ourself, of our being. And harmonizing means then also composing them into a new entity, which is more and beyond the sum total of the different parts, or the simple compromise across these elements. And it's interesting because then these elements acquire a new meaning in and of themselves, simply because they become part of something else, but part in a very specific way. Therefore, harmonizing implies and entails an act of creation. Yeah? But that act of creation needs to be activated by a spark, by some dynamism, by some dynamic force. And that dynamic force, as Assagioli tells us, comes from the will. The social and the political will means that you have referred to a little bit earlier. Now, that is very important, because also these studies tell us that this will shouldn't be only strong, but also has to be a loving will, has to be wise, and is a will that needs to look beyond the personal interest or the individual interest. And therefore, to dedicate time to study how will operates is actually quite important. So now, if I reason by analogy, I can probably imagine the United Nations through the General Assembly, through the Security Council, through the other bodies that constitute its work, like as a mechanism to leverage, harness, catalyze will. That will, that in itself is the harmonizer, and that basically activate the will of the nations that are supposed to cooperate, and the peoples of the United Nations that are supposed to cooperate in the attainment of that common good that has been freely and commonly chosen, and in this case, for instance, the SDGs. Now, if this is true, then again, enhancing the way we use that will is a direct contribution to building that center. So the more we become skillful in using the will, individual will, collective will, that center in itself gets reinforced. And therefore, if that center gets reinforced, it becomes more capable of understanding what are the elements that drive the lack of harmony, which manifest themselves into conflict, into inequalities, gender discrimination, environmental degradation, conflicts, you name it. It's in our daily life full of examples. So strengthening that center through this purposeful act of will, conscious act of will, in itself makes this center more and more capable of helping humanity to go forwards. And that in itself also evokes the content of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I also believe is spectacular, which I want to quote here in this room with you. It says, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and consciousness, and should act towards one another in spirit of brotherhood." That is what we are supposed to do. and it's low, interestingly enough. Now, so the United Nations appears to be a catalyzer of a collective will to good in order to mobilize goodwill. So it's a very purposeful, constant action that needs to be enacted not only by the delegates of the states, not only by the international civil servants, but also all the others that contribute to the functioning of the United Nations, civil society, business, and so on and so forth. Now, again, this background, I really believe that is critical then to reflect on these centers and to ask ourselves, what are its characteristics? What does it entail and requires to work for such a center? How is it supposed to work? Very, very simple questions. How the different stakeholders, states, NGO representatives, civil societies are supposed to do. And then as a consequence also how international civil servants, UN civil servants are supposed to work in light of these precepts. Now, the question is, do we need to do something particular in light of Article 1.4? If we are committed to work for a center that is supposed to harmonize the actions of nations, do we need to do something a bit more specific to make it happen? It's in the charter. For a civil servant like me, is an obligation, is a legal obligation. So it's a fundamental question that I need to ask myself, but also everybody else that works for that in service of these principles. So what type of attitude do we need to have? What approach to the work do we need to bring with us? How do I prepare myself, not only at a professional level, but also on a personal level? And Mintz have given us a lot of instances on how this personal dimension is important. So constant professional performance, but also continuing personal developments are really key in making this center functioning. Now, from what we're saying then, of course, it seems to me that the United Nations goes a little bit beyond being a room, like a building like this, a building in New York, a General Assembly room, is not limited to it. And it's probably go into being a mindset, an approach, a space, a psychic space of some sort. And it's because of this that I believe that it's not by chance that Dag Hammarskjöld wanted to have a meditation room at the United Nations in New York. And he dedicated himself to it. Now, this brings me into the question of Dag Hammarskjöld and international civil service and ethics. Now, if what I'm saying is has some foundation, so how do international civil servants need to contribute to the work of the United Nations? And again, Hammarskjöld is interesting because in all his work, he's constantly articulated the role of the Secretary General and the role of the Secretariat. Under his leadership, the first code of conduct had been adopted. Precisely because he was really guiding his staff, and he's still guiding us, in fact, because his legacy is alive and must be taken forward and embodied, on how to behave in service of international cooperation. And himself defined and I quote, the essential role of an international civil service in an irrevocably interdependent world. So he clearly saw the service role that international civil service had for international cooperation, and therefore more works need to be done in order to define the model of this international service for the 21st century. What does international service mean in this century? And not only for international civil servants, but also all those who want to cooperate and to enhance international cooperation through our daily activities, be it a company, an NGO, a trust, you name it. Now, in my views, in my experience, then civil servants are there to support the evocation of this collective will that we have been referring to, and to create that space in which this will can be materialized and manifested. I mean, international civil servants, they're kind of, in French, like a notaire, the custodian of the collective will that then needs to be manifested. So the civil servants are like the builders, the construction workers of a space, of an environment, and the architects, meaning those who come and forge that will, being delegates, representatives of civil society, business, academia, etc., come here, put together ideas together, and chart the way forward for collective action. Now, but for civil servants to be able to play this role, civil servants need to be trusted in order to be entrusted with such a role. And therefore, the independence, the neutrality, and the international responsibilities of civil servants is critical, meaning maintaining the international character. And the United Nations Charter is very strong in saying in Article 100 that civil servants shall not seek or receive instructions from any government or any other authority, because you need to be able to be a broker of goodwill across all partners. And it's quite interesting because Dag Hammarskjöld clearly helped not only define international cooperation, so the function of the UN, but also international cooperation as such. You know, and when you read, for me it was a spectacular learning, when you read his personal diary called Markings in English, and the speeches that he was giving at the General Assembly and the Security Council, it was a powerful mix of amazing understanding of politics and ethics at the same time. It was constantly, giving fire to the discussion. I would say, kind of living ethics he was embodying. And there are a couple of passages that you will find in the document that I circulated that I would like. I will read just one, but it says the public servant is there in order to assist, so to say, from the inside, those who make the decision which frame history. He should, as I see it, listen, analyze, and learn to understand fully the forces at work and the interests at stake, so that he will be able to give the right advice when the situation calls for it. Don't think that he takes but a passive part in the development. He is a most active one, but is active as an instrument, a catalyst, and perhaps an inspires. He serves. Close the quote. So this gives you, a bit of a flavor of what Hammarskjöld's thinking and behavior was. He was strongly calling in his action for the judgment, meaning you have to be very clear on how you exercise and how to use your mind. And he was also calling for staff to keep themselves, and he started from himself, and he was saying, in another quote you will find in the booklet, the international civil servant must keep himself under the strictest observation so that his personal traits don't take him away. It's not that he cannot have preferences, he just needs to keep them under control. And he was saying this is not only international civil servants that needs to do that, judges as well. So, but integrity and the respect of the law, if that brings you in conflict with some interest, well, that conflict is a sign of your integrity, of your neutrality. So in a way, Hammarskjöld really dived into international relations to transform them from coexistence to international cooperation. So he really acted as a transformer of this dimension, really moving from intergovernmental to international. And there's a lot of behind it that can be read and understood. And so an international cooperation that could be described as relations serving a planetary and plan inspired by a common purpose, which is also what meant earlier. And now, in 1945, the United Nations Charter member states really committed to something very unique in recorded history, which is the commitment to international cooperation for development. That had never happened before, at least to my knowledge. And so it's something relatively new. And I think that we need to still approach the work of the United Nations as an experiment. And if we approach it in that way, then we can keep alive the flame and the fire of research, of commitment, of enthusiasm, of keeping searching for how it can be used better. Because we can't give it for granted. That would be a tremendous loss. We need to keep understanding better what it is and how to use it, as Hammarskjöld in his years of leadership did. And himself is saying that we are moving toward a constitutional system of international cooperation, so a system based on the law, human rights law, environmental law, which basically is the embodiment of right relations between humans and between the humans and the environment. That is a fundamental endeavor. Of course, such transition doesn't happen smoothly, and it does depend on the capacity of individuals and groups to comprehend the vastness and the dimension of international cooperation and the fire that required to take it forward, and how to expand our own consciousness. So it's like of a gymnastic, I would say, that we need to exercise on a daily basis. But it's also an interesting virtuous cycle, because the more the collective work focused on the common good, the more this common good calls for better forms of cooperation. Better forms for cooperation identified an enhanced common good. So if we manage to enter in that positive loop, we are really on track on evolution. It's not that it's easy, but it's definitely the pathway has been already marked and is out there. It's been practiced for now a number of decades, and therefore concepts like domestic jurisdiction, self-determination, national interest, they can no longer be used to defend interest only, but rather to stimulate the best that countries can offer to international cooperation. And this can happen in these rooms and, of course, outside. Hammarskjöld called it a new nationalism, in fact. So it's not that we no longer want it. We want it, but we want its best. The best that countries and nations can offer to the world, and the best that the people of those nations, which are called in the preamble of the UN Charter, can and are expected to offer to the international cooperation. So not only the governments in themselves, civil society as well. Now I'm coming to sort of the conclusion of what I wanted to share with you, but certainly these 4 agreements that I mentioned earlier, they constitute a unique plan that humanity has managed to put together for the first time. And it's really forcing us to think through in different ways on how different type of sciences, different type of field of endeavor, they can look at in an holistic manner and take them forward implementing. And that's why Dr. Navarro was speaking in terms of the ethics of the SDGs. So again here, I really want to emphasize there is the first time ever that humanity managed to come to a room through quite a process and agree on a paradigm that is a scale of the planet. It's a planetary scope endeavor that we are. So this is definitely a new page in international cooperation, and the United Nations has been an instrument to it, and is an opportunity to contribute to it. Now, so in conclusion, I really want to tell you that I strongly believe that it is important that all those who contribute to international cooperation, all those who contribute to the work of the United Nations, really let's focus on what is the meaning of this harmonizing the actions of nations, which starts from harmonizing our own actions and then acting them. And then what it means for the functioning of the United Nations, what it means for international cooperation, and how do I approach it from a personal perspective, in a personal manner as well as in a professional fashion. And I would like to conclude with Dag Hammarskjöld's words, because I think that, it seems to be an impossible task, but Hammarskjöld tells us, working at the edge of development of human society is to work on the brink of the unknown. Much of what is done will one day prove to have been of little avail. There is no excuse for the failure to act in accordance with our best understanding, in recognition of its limits, but with faith that in the ultimate result of the creative evolution in which it is our privilege to cooperate. Thank you.